All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 14, Section 2, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Republican Party. Now recall in the last chapter, 14-1, talked about the Compromise of 1850, which had seemed to have put an end to this issue of slavery in the Western Territories once and for all. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would pass in 1854, so that's 4 years later, would revive the issue of slavery. So this question about slavery in the Western Territories was somewhat quiet for about 4 years. Recall that it was during that time that you had the new Fugitive Slave Act, which was still sort of causing conflicts in the North, that underneath the surface, maybe there was greater tension between the free states and the slave states. But at least on the surface, the Compromise of 1850 seemed to have settled the issue of slavery in the West once and for all, again, until the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Following the election of 1852, saw Franklin Pierce become the president. If I can spell president correctly. President in 1852, and he really didn't have a strong position on slavery. Instead, he advocated for what was called the Young America movement, which was overseas expansion and to spread democracy. And, that was really required because what a lot of these politicians are doing in the 1850s is they're avoiding the topic of slavery, because once you talk about slavery, then all Northerners choose one side and all Southerners choose one side. So if you can talk about or run on a platform of overseas expansion and spreading democracy, well, that's something that both Northerners and Southerners could potentially get on board for. Now to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which potentially, recreates or revives this issue of slavery once again. So the purpose behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act is to create 2 new states. And the reason is to build a transcontinental railroad, right? So that's the goal. A transcontinental railroad is a railroad that stretches the whole continent, so it reaches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, right? That's the goal. And, the railroad company doesn't want to build it across territories. It wants to build it across states because states have certain protections. States have legal systems. Territories are still kind of the Wild West. So the goal is to create 2 new states so that a railroad can be built across the country. More specifically, Stephen Douglas is the supporter of Kansas-Nebraska Act. He's the same one who created the Compromise of 1850. He is from Illinois, and he hopes that this railroad can, leave out of Chicago. So that's kind of his motive behind this. He wants to make sure his home state of Illinois is one of these states where the Transcontinental Railroad passes through. So that's why he is promoting this as his law. Now, what Stephen Douglas does is he underestimates the importance of slavery, just how divisive of an issue this is, and just how much people care about this issue. Douglas is more concerned with things like railroads than he is with this particular issue. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 1854. Pretty much all Northerners vote no, and all Southerners vote yes. And why is that? Well, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was that it opened up Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty. And again, recall from last section, popular sovereignty is to vote on the legality of slavery, right? So the people in Kansas and Nebraska are going to vote on whether or not slavery should be legal. Well, what's the big deal with that? Well, according to the Missouri Compromise, which was created in 1820, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, according to that, are free, right? They're free soil. And what popular sovereignty is doing is that it's opening up these territories potentially now to have where slavery is illegal. And that, of course, is rejected by the North. And that's why all Northerners vote no. They're saying, wait a minute, this was territory that was marked by the Missouri Compromise as being free soil. You can't go back and change it. And that's what makes Kansas-Nebraska probably the most egregious of these conflicts about Western territory, because when it came to other states like California, when it came to Texas, when it came to Missouri, the legality of slavery there was at the very least ambiguous, right? It wasn't clear as to whether or not slavery was legal or illegal. In this case, these territories were clearly free, and now what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is doing is that they're opening them up to slavery, and this is where Northerners protest. The Whig Party, which had been part of the second party system, dies, right? The Whig Party is no more. It was split between Northerners and Southerners, right? Southerners leave for the Democratic Party. Northerners create a new political party, the Republican Party. So this is a new party, which is essentially created as the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Party, right? That is the complete foundation for the Republican Party. And of course, they take many Northerners. A lot of people who were Whigs now are jumping on board with the Republican Party. Many people who are in the Free Soil Party are now jumping in with the Republican Party. So the second party system that we've talked about, where you had Whigs and Democrats, and these were two parties that were, essentially competitive all throughout the entire nation, that completely breaks down. The Whigs, many jump ship for the Republican. And many Southerners join the Democratic Party. And so now you get a political party system where all Northerners are joining the Republican Party, all Southerners are joining the Democratic Party. So that is one of the very important consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It is the ending, and again, we'll use our red here. It is the ending of the second party system, right? That political system dies. A second major consequence is what actually happens in Kansas itself, and that is known as Bleeding Kansas. So again, popular sovereignty means that they will vote on the legality of slavery. And so when the vote is held, you have a lot of border ruffians. These are pro-slavery people from Missouri, right? So, Missouri is on this side. Kansas is on this side. Missouri is, a slave state. And so what these border ruffians do is they cross over the border and vote. And this leads to the Lecompton Constitution, which passes as the pro-slavery Constitution. Northerners cry foul, and specifically the House of Representatives refuses to acknowledge this as legitimate. They say that this essentially is illegal. So there's still a fight going on in the Senate between Northerners and Southerners where they can't agree upon the Lecompton Constitution. In order to provide reinforcements for the Northern position, or the anti-slavery position, the New England Emigrant Aid Society provides resources for the anti-slave, we'll just say forces in Kansas, right? And so you have people from the free states. We'll say this is the border of Missouri. We have free states up here. They're also moving into Missouri, right, to try and stop slavery from expanding. And you can probably get an idea of where this is going. And because you have proponents of the free state moving, proponents of the slave state moving, that leads to death. And this is going to be a very bad skull and crossbones to represent what is Bleeding Kansas. And that is the violence between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces that go into Kansas, because popular sovereignty opened it up, said, look, whichever side has the most votes wins. So if you're anti-slavery, you move to Kansas trying to make it free. If you're pro-slavery, you move to Kansas trying to make it slave. And those two sides clash. There's violence in the city of Lawrence, Kansas. This is pro-slavery violence. Then in retaliation, you have John Brown, who is a radical abolitionist. And at the Pottawatomie Creek, he massacres pro-slavery forces. Right? So again, Bleeding Kansas is the violence in Kansas after Kansas-Nebraska Act. You might be asking, well, what about Nebraska? Well, Nebraska was so far north that Nebraska was a free state. There really wasn't any question about it. It was all going to be about whether or not Kansas would be a free or slave state. Again, Bleeding Kansas. Meanwhile, on the Senate, Charles Sumner gives a speech. Charles Sumner is a northern senator. He gives a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. He's obviously talking about the fact that you're taking free soil and potentially flipping it into slave territory. He says that Northerners are willing to do battle for the virgin soil of Kansas. Gives a very scathing speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he likens Southern civilization to, I think he says, drunken spew. Preston Brooks, who is a Southern congressman, beats Charles Sumner into a coma with a cane. This event is sometimes referred to as the caning of Sumner. All right, so now we have to think about, okay, well, what is the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually done? Well, it's led to violence in Kansas. You have pro and anti-slavery forces killing one another. Bleeding Kansas is sometimes called the Civil War before the Civil War. This is happening in the 1850s. The Civil War breaks out 5 years later, but it's essentially the same factions. And in Congress, you have Southern congressmen beating Northern congressmen into comas with canes, right? So this is an uptick of violence regarding the issue of slavery. Here's a picture of Lawrence, Kansas, after some of the violence that took place. There were even artillery and cannons and stuff like that that were being brought in. And so this is all surrounding or going against the backdrop of the presidential election of 1856, in which you have, again, the political shakeup. The new political system, the second party system, is gone. The American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, gets a small amount of votes. This is the anti-immigrant party. It's mostly in the North, right, because the Whig Party is gone. So some people end up joining the Know Nothing Party or the American Party. The Republican Party, which is brand new, nominates John C. Fremont, he's from California, as their nomination. Republican Party ends up getting 33% of the vote as a party that's only 2 years old, right? So it's maybe showing some of the potential that this party has if it has a couple more years in order to organize. The Democratic Party elects James Buchanan, who was in England the whole time this was happening. So really, he also has no position on slavery. In fact, Stephen Douglas, who was the hero, let's see, where's Stephen Douglas, right? Stephen Douglas, who was the hero of 1850, has now become the villain because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that's why he doesn't run for president, because he's so toxic, he's so divisive, whether you're for Kansas or against Kansas. And it's James Buchanan that ends up winning the presidential election of 1856.